Mold is a nasty, nasty business, and it's one of the leading causes of gut disease that we see in the Western world. And so our job here today is just to figure out what you can do about it to heal your gut and get to the root of some of these issues.
My name is Michael Rubino. I'm on a personal mission to make sure you don't get sick inside your own home.
I knew there was something wrong. I'm just so relieved there's something that you can do about it.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining another amazing episode of Never Been Sicker. I'm very excited for this next guest. Josh, welcome so much to the podcast. Thank you so much for taking the time to be here. Please go ahead and introduce yourself and let everyone know why you're here.
Michael, thanks so much for having me. It is a pleasure to be here. The number one reason we're here is because mold is a nasty, nasty business, and it's one of the leading causes of gut disease that we see in the Western world. And so our job here today is just to figure out what you can do about it to heal your gut and get to the root of some of these issues.
That's awesome. And could you explain a little bit about, what you do and how you help people specifically deal with some of these problems?
I'd love to. So my job primarily, I'm a holistic nutritionist by trade, and I'm a gut specialist. So I work in Crohn's, Colitis, severe IBS, that work as a medical lecturer and a physician's consultant for these diseases as well. And our job is getting to the root of the problem. A lot of the Western world, the ideology is that disease is just innate to your biology, that there's nothing you can do about it. It's part of who you are. You have this disease because you're human. And so your only hope is to mask the symptoms with expensive medication. We look at the body differently and go, wait a minute, your body doesn't make mistakes. Something has to be causing it. And so rather than just covering the symptoms, our job is to get to the root and remove it, because the inflammation of the symptoms you're experiencing, it's simply your body reacting to something. And if we can prevent that reaction and give the tools it needs to begin healing itself and reversing this disease process, it will. And we've seen that with these supposedly irreversible lifelong conditions like even Crohn's or colitis, which are the most severe on the gut disease spectrum. We've seen those reversed hundreds of times by getting to the root.
Isn't that interesting as you sit back and as you're talking, I'm kind of sitting back and reflecting on this, but it's like this whole ideology that we have in Western medicine. It's like you would think that you have a headache because you have a Tylenol deficiency or an Advil deficiency, right? And it's like, no, there's something else wrong. And the headache is the symptom and really giving us that alert signal that something is wrong. And it could be as simple as dehydration, right?
It's so simple. I think of it this way, Michael. And this is a story I think will just stick in your brain more than anything else in the world, or analogy rather. Imagine you're outside, you're going for a walk and you step on a nail, and that nail goes through your foot. And of course, it's going to get red. It's going to get infected because your body is inflaming and fighting back against something in your body that should not be in your body. So you go to the doctor and you look at them and say, hey, got this nail in my foot. It's causing me a problem. They go, yeah, it's really inflamed. It's really infected. It's really bad. But Michael, unfortunately, that nail is just part of your DNA now. It's just part of your body. There's nothing we can do. So here's some numbing cream for the pain. Use it for the rest of your life. And if it doesn't help, we'll just cut your foot off. What an insane scenario to even try to think about. But when we go back and look at the way they look at disease, whether it's a hysterectomy, whether it's getting your gallbladder out because of gallstones, or in my specialty being Crohn's and colitis or bowel disease, where they just cut the colon out. They go, yep, that illness is just part of your body. It's part of your DNA. Here's something to manage the symptoms, be it a biologic, immunosuppressant, antidiarrheals, or whatever it might be. And if it doesn't work, we'll just cut the organ out. It's insane. And so we have to understand your body is only inflaming because it's reacting to something. If we find it, problem solved.
What's even crazier about some of the example you gave is you have the gaslighting element in there as well, where you stepped on a nail, you go to the doctor, that same exact scenario, and the doctor's like, what nail? There's no nail, and you have that element of like, now my doctor doesn't believe me and I did step on a nail, and you have that whole thing. And so, for so many people out there, they're trying to get to that root cause. It can be very difficult, right? Because of that ideology, some of the gaslighting components that people experience every day. And it's like, all we're trying to do as a society is get down to the root cause, of what we're doing here. And so right. You mentioned that you're a gut health specialist. I want to understand, and I want everyone else listening to understand how gut health plays such a pivotal role in human health. Can you explain a little bit about, that phenomenon?
I would love to. Gut health, I argue, or I should say your gut bacteria, I will argue are as important, if not in some ways more important than your very own DNA. And I say this because depending on the studies and who you ask, your gut bacteria outnumber you up to 10 to 1. In fact, Yashuda Schoenfeld out of Tel Aviv University, he's one of the godfathers of autoimmune disease research. And he says you are born 99% human cells, 1% microbe, what you get coming through the birth canal, in utero, etc. And so these bacteria are very small. It's like seeds in a meadow before it turns and grows into a rainforest. And he says you are 99% human, 1% microbes. By the time you die, you are 90% microbes and only 10% human. So they outnumber us vastly. They have influences on your DNA and genetic expression. They can determine your microbes, not your genes so much, but your microbes can even determine how social you feel like being on a given day, what diseases you will or will not get. 90% of your neurotransmitters, the things that make your brain go, that make you tick, that make you excited, feel joy, feel pleasure, feel whatever you feel, they're made inside your gut. 70 to 90% of your immune cells are both grown, matured, and housed inside of your gut. Your gut microbes are responsible for vitamin production, like B vitamins and vitamin K. They're responsible for detoxification, inflammatory and immune responses, hormonal balances. They do everything. And again, they influence your genetic expression, be it for better or worse. And so if we're not taking care of our guts and our gut microbes, we are literally dying. In fact, the disease epidemic that we're seeing these days, that we're seeing nowadays in North America, and I mean it's an epidemic, this is a result, I believe, of what we're calling generational dysbiosis, or this progressive loss of our microbes. And just to contextualize that for you, Michael, we know 66% of US adults take at least one prescription medication, 50% take two, 25% take four or more. 60% of adults have one or more chronic diseases. 40% have two or more chronic diseases. 15 to 20% suffer from some kind of autoimmune type condition. And 93% of the leading causes of death are both gut and food related. So heart disease, liver, kidney, stroke, cancer, etc., diabetes, obesity. So we have to understand your microbes, which also influence weight gain and loss and insulin. There's so much to them. And one of the reasons that you and I are having this conversation is because this sacred microbiome, this ecosystem of microbes that outnumber us 10 to 1, they are directly impacted and destroyed by things like a moldy environment.
Yeah, it's really kind of an interesting thing when you talk about microbiome. You know, we have the gut microbiome, and then we have the environment microbiome in which we live. And that obviously has an ability to influence the gut microbiome, mainly because a lot of the stuff that we're breathing in is so small it bypasses our self-defense mechanism, like our respiratory tract, for example,
Right.
and it enters our bloodstream. So essentially, what we inhale not only can affect respiratory, but also can affect the gut because of that ingestion aspect, because of the particles being so small. So when you have things like microplastics and mold and bacteria in your environment because you're living in a water damaged or moldy home, that definitely can cause some dysbiosis, can it?
Absolutely. Without question. In fact, it is known, there's a fancy word for it called pleomorphing, which actually comes from a Greek origin. But the idea is, picture you have this really nice balance of bacteria, almost like waves in an ocean. It comes up and comes down, it grows and dies and turns over constantly, but it's very much in sync, like a waveform of sound. And this is called homeostasis. As you get an infection, you get sick, something comes into the body, you eat McDonald's or you eat something healthy, those bacteria are constantly changing and adapting. The problem is when we get mold in the system, we get this infection of mold. It actually takes those and turns these little up and down waves into tidal waves and tsunamis. And so now you have bad guys overgrowing. It's prime breeding ground for things like parasites. You have opportunistic microbes that love the inflamed environment. You have holes forming inside the intestines. We call this leaky gut. Just dozens of things that start to go wrong when mold enters the system, and it disrupts this very sacred and delicate ecosystem inside of our guts.
So I want to take things a little simpler, and let's explain for people what gut dysbiosis is. And I think that's really important because we're going to probably hear that 100 times in this episode.
Yeah, so if we were to define gut dysbiosis, it's an imbalance in the composition of your gut microbiome. And so we want to define your gut microbiome as this ecosystem of upwards of 100 trillion microbes. There's parasites, fungi, yeast, viruses, bacteria, all kinds of things living inside of your gut together. It's like a community. Every single one of them, the good guys and the bad guys, all have some kind of role to play, right? Whether we like it or not, Michael, the crack dealer at the gas station has some role to play in the economy, be it big or small. Even the yeast, the parasites, the viruses in your gut have a role to play in this ecosystem. They keep things in check, keep it balanced. The problem is dysbiosis, by definition, is imbalance of this gut microbiome, whether it's because of inflammation, antibiotics, the world we live in, not even being compatible with our own biology anymore, looking at what's changed in the way of food and culture and stress and electronics and on the list goes. But these things have changed the balance of our ecosystem. Now, every grocery store and coffee shop is just selling crack. And so everything starts to fall apart. The economy, the ecosystem begins to break down. And the body, the host, becomes sick because they're not getting what they need from what could be an ideal balance for society in your gut, so to speak. So this is what dysbiosis is. It's imbalance leading to breakdown and dysfunction, which all the functions we talked about, your immune system and neurotransmitters and anti-inflammatory and vitamin balance and minerals and detoxing, all of these systems break down when we enter a state of dysbiosis. And the greater the state of dysbiosis, the greater the risk or severity of disease that we're going to develop.
Now, obviously, dysbiosis, that means it could have something that is too little, something that's too much, overgrown, et cetera, overabundance. And there are different ways to measure different things in the gut. So you could actually take a look at what's too low, what needs to come up, what's too high, what needs to come down to get back into that harmonious balance.
That's exactly it. Balancing dysbiosis doesn't mean necessarily just taking probiotics, right? You could have too much of a good thing. Even a condition very commonly known as SIBO, that's small intestinal bacterial overgrowth. If you have, say, too much of certain microbes that you happen to be taking in probiotic form, you're now contributing to the problem. And so dysbiosis is too much or too little of both the bad and good. Remember, the bad I use loosely because they have a role to play when they're in the appropriate amounts. When there's too much of them, school teachers and baristas, most people love them, but when you have too many of them in an economy, nothing gets done because it's just coffee and children running around. Nobody's working the factories. Nobody's running the garbage. And, so it's all about balance of both good and bad appropriately in this ecosystem working together. So dysbiosis is the imbalance in either direction, and both of them can create their own problems.
Now, we already mentioned how mold can be a bad player amongst this gut dysbiosis that we can experience. And how difficult, if not impossible, is it to get your gut back in balance if you're stuck in a moldy environment?
If you think of it this way, you are jumping on a trampoline and you break your leg. How hard is it to heal your gut or heal your leg if you keep jumping on the trampoline? It's actively broken and you're continuing to repeat with the insult that caused the problem in the first place. And so if you have mold that came in and created this inflammation, poked holes in the gut lining, suppressed the immune system, it changed the landscape of your gut bacteria entirely. Now you're exposing yourself to mold over and over and over again. You are continuing to put insult to injury. And no matter how much you try to pull the mold out, you're putting too much in. Now you're inflamed, your gut bacteria is changing, so you're not actually detoxing it properly. So you're not getting rid of it faster than it comes in. In fact, it's the other way. We are getting too much, and now you're overflowing. And so if you're constantly re-inoculating, re-exposing, perfect example, I got a client of mine, really sad situation. They had a 5-year-old boy who was actually diagnosed with ulcerative colitis. So he has blood in his bowel. It's got holes in it, ulcerations in his large intestine, his bacteria. We took a stool sample and measured his gut microbiome. It was one of the worst I've seen, even in adults with a history of drug use and abuse. And so it was really quite a disaster. And it turns out the home was full of mold. It was affecting the whole family. We'll focus on the boy. So he was coming in with severe ulcerative colitis, blood in the stool, 10 plus bowel movements a day. He was limping around the house, pale and gray. His hair was thinning. His joints hurt so much he couldn't go outside. He was tired all the time, sleeping 16 hours a day. He's 5.
Wow.
way too young for this stuff to be happening. But his issue was mold. So he ended up in the hospital a few times. His parents took action right away. They moved him out to a trailer. They got a trailer, put it on the street. Dad slept out there with him. He moved out of the house. And within a couple of days, because he's very young, right, he started getting better. Adults typically take a lot longer, but he started improving. Or if he got really sick, he'd go to the hospital. He'd stay there for a few days and feel better, go back home. Within a few days, he's sick again because he kept re-inoculating. And the sad part is they did a remediation, did the home, but they went back. This is actually something I talked to you about on my show as well, was this boy in this home. And after the remediation, they went back in. He was a little better, started getting worse. They brought a mold dog in. 42 points in the home they found were full of mold. They cut open the drywall. It's in the lumber used to frame the house. And so he's continually re-inoculating. He's getting sick again because this mold is still proliferating and still growing. So to put a long story short, if you continue to inoculate, you will get sick or sicker, and it will continue to remove yourself.
Yeah, and I think it's a really important point because a lot of people listening, they're looking for help. They, looking for answers on remediation of their home, looking on ways to heal the body, and it's important to really talk through that. I mean, you have to get yourself out of the issue that's causing this gut dysbiosis. Otherwise, you continue to go down this path. We also have a gut to brain connection that we hear so much about. What is that exact connection, and what does it mean for us as humans?
It's really important. I'm glad you asked this question because we talk about the gut brain. I think we hear things sensationalized in social media. And by the time it sort of follows this game of telephone, the message started with grandma's buying a hammock. And by the time it gets done, it goes, grandma wants 6 more banana sandwiches. It's not what it should be. We hear gut brain connection and think, yes, they're talking, but what does it mean? There's really 3 primary things that I look at in the gut brain connection. Number 1 is going to be neurological. So we have 12 cranial nerves, so these major nerve structures in the brain. There's this big one comes down the left side, down your neck, connects to your heart, your lungs, your intestines, and all your digestive organs. It's called the vagus nerve, also popularized and sensationalized, but it comes down this long, thick chunk and it actually spreads out like a horse's tail and it innervates all around your intestines. In fact, there's nerves connecting your organs, your digestive system that go into the spine and back to the brain. So not only does the connection come down, but it goes back up and through the vagus nerve. It's also what we call bidirectional. So the connection of the vagus nerve does come up and down. So there's this neurological, like hardwired electric connection between your brain and your gut. Now they're talking back and forth. Think of a gut feeling. If you have this sensation, this reaction in your gut, it has to be processed. One, in your gut can create contractions. You feel that feeling in your gut when something bad's about to happen. But also it sends signals to the brain, which can trigger this fight and flight mechanism, turn on the adrenaline to get you safe. Or if you have an anxious response in your brain, maybe there's a PTSD or a common situation or something, there's family members who are drunks and you hate them and they're coming over, you're like, oh, you start thinking about it and getting nervous. The signal goes down to the gut now and you start to get these loose, icky bowels. And so it's this bidirectional neurological connection. On the other hand, it's also a chemical connection. There are brain chemicals we call neurotransmitters. When you think about how nerves communicate, you have these 2 ends. Think of them like these, like almost like touching 2 Q-tips together. And the end of the Q-tip, you have this little gap in between. Well, these neurotransmitters, what happens is the Q-tip charges up this electrical signal. It gets picked up by all these little connectors in between this dead space, and they pick it up and carry it across to the next Q-tip. That's how your nerves communicate. These neurotransmitters take signals from one nerve, carry them across this gap into the next nerve. And this is how things communicate. Well, neurotransmitters, 90 or so percent of the ones your brain uses, they're made in your gut. Your dopamine and your serotonin, they're all made in your gut. Your feel-good chemicals, your focus chemicals. If you got anxiety, depression, ADHD, you probably got a gut issue. Even bipolar and schizophrenia, you're going to have a gut issue. It all comes back down to the same thing. So it's neurotransmitters. So our first connection is neurological. It's a hardwired nerve electric signal. The second is chemical, which carries a lot of this electrical signal as well. And if your gut is all messy, this is the factory producing these chemicals. If it's on fire, it's not going to successfully produce what you need it to produce. So if it's inflamed, if your gut bacteria are all out of balance because of the say a mold infection, you're not going to have the same neurochemical production. So you're going to be at a deficiency. And the last connection is going to be toxins. Mold is a toxin. It overactivates the immune system. It leads to this change in gut microbes. Well, we have to look at our gut bacteria. I think of them as fish in a fishbowl. So if you think about this, Michael, we got fish sitting in a fishbowl. The fish are the living organism. These are the probiotics or the bacteria, fungi, whatever's living in your gut. All right, that's the fish. Now that fish has to eat. These are prebiotics that come in. So it's what you eat, your fibers and starches and sugars, the things that your fish will eat. And they poop just like you do. They produce postbiotics. Now they produce good things or bad things. If you have good fish eating good food, they produce good fish poop, so to speak, like neurotransmitters, vitamins, hormonal balancing, or short chain fatty acids, we call them, a vital nutrient for the body. These are produced by the good fish or the good bacteria. But if you have an overgrowth of bad guys, they poop out bad stuff that's bad for the ecosystem. It toxifies the fishbowl. It muddies the water. And these toxins create leaks in the gut. They get through into your bloodstream, into your lymphatic system, which are the superhighways around the body, and they travel all over the place. And they can actually pass the blood-brain barrier, which is a sacred mesh like a cheesecloth, which will determine what does and doesn't get into the brain. So if you have mycotoxins from mold, they can pass the blood-brain barrier. If you have toxins from certain microbes in your gut that are overgrown now or imbalanced, they can pass the blood-brain barrier. They cause inflammation. It can even lead to leaky brain, opening that blood-brain barrier further, letting more and more stuff in. And so the mental health, cognition starts to decline even further. And so your big three connections are chemical, neurological, and toxicity, really.
Right. So we have these environmental toxins invading our bodies with every breath that we take. We're getting gut dysbiosis that's affecting the neurological systems as well with that
Right.
gut-brain connection. So, we can experience things like chronic fatigue, right? Like things like brain fog, things like anxiety or depression, right? Because of that neurological impact. And then we also hear a lot about, with this gut dysbiosis, we talked about different things that are in the gut, but you hear a lot about like, okay, if I have mold in my environment, all of a sudden I might test high for Candida, which might be strange because maybe I've never really even heard of that before or ever tested high for that. Or now I have an overgrowth of something like parasites, right? And again, parasites, Candida, this is a yeast, this is part of our ecosystem. But when it's overgrowth, right, we have too much of it. That's when things start to really just by definition be gut dysbiosis. So I guess, knowing that it can cause imbalances and we might see some of these things, do we always expect to see like an overgrowth of parasites if we're in a moldy environment or an overgrowth of Candida in a moldy environment? Or is that just where things fall depending on what actually shakes out of this gut dysbiosis?
Yeah, I think it's more accurate to probably say the second half of what you're alluding to here is that mold in the system creates an environment for these other opportunistic microbes to flourish. Right? If you get rid of the police in a community, gun runners and drug dealers, they take over. They'll do whatever they want. All the bad guys. There's no one policing them. And so your gut, this ecosystem polices itself. It can crowd out certain microbes. It can kill off certain microbes. It can keep this balance. But when you have mold in the system, that balance is thrown off, which creates an environment for things, these opportunistic microbes like your Candida, your parasites, and other fungus to begin overgrowing and now contributing to the problem. Mold, because it does a couple things, right? It changes that ecosystem. It inflames the environment, which these bad guys love, an inflamed environment. It changes the balance of good and bad, which takes down your defenses. It creates leaks. It stresses the immune system. So all your tools you'd normally use to fight off invaders or microbes overgrowing, they're depressed. They're depleted. And so you're not going to be keeping things at bay to the same strength or opportunity you could have prior to the mold coming in. So it's very much a breeding ground or an opportunity for things to grow.
Now I want to talk a little bit about genetics and epigenetics. How much does genetics really play a role in this? Or is it really just the environmental situations which we're in? And environmental, I mean, could be taking lots of antibiotics, right? Could be living in a moldy environment, or is it more of these external factors and sort of epigenetics that kind of drive things out of whack? Or do genetics have a role to play?
Genetics are absolutely a role. I mean, epigenetics is sort of these heritable changes in gene expression. And so we can see this through things like trauma. There's a really interesting study done in epigenetics it was specifically about trauma, but my understanding, interpretation as it relates to epigenetics, where there was a set of mice. They actually exposed them and they were in a cage, and the floor of the cage was electrified. They could charge it up or charge it down and zap the mice. And they put a smell of cherry blossom into the cage. And every time the cherry blossom smell would come in, they'd shock the mice's feet. And then every time they do it again, they'd shock them again until eventually, it didn't take long, the mice learned to fear the cherry blossom. They instilled this fear response all the way down to the mice's grandchildren, having never exposed the rest of that lineage to cherry blossom smell. They were afraid of the smell. So we see this inherited epigenetic response to things, but truthfully, I don't know how it's going to react to mold. On the other hand, there are genetics that do affect mold. For example, how you become inflamed. You could put 10 people in a room, Michael, and all of them get exposed to mold. You get exposed, I get exposed, 10 or 8 other people get exposed. One of them might get Parkinson's, one might get arthritis, one might get Alzheimer's, one's going to get asthma, one's going to get IBS, one gets Crohn's, one gets colitis. 2 of them get nothing. It just depends on how your genetic expression is and how it relates to mold. So I look at it this way. If your genes get pulled, it's like a chain. When you pull on that chain, the weak link is going to break first. And if your genes are set to express inflammation or damage or whatever it is through this pathway, that mold might cause this particular issue. Now, there's a chain of events connected, whether it's bacteria or direct to the immune system, whatever it is. But this is where you'll typically break first. Now, there's a really popularized gene we know as MTHFR. That's methylene tetrahydrofolate reductase. I learned that so I sound really smart. Love big words. But this MTHFR, more commonly known, feel free to bleep me, as the motherfucker gene. And this affects your body's ability to methylate, which is this critical process of DNA or detoxification. It does DNA repair. It's responsible for immune function and how you utilize things like folate or folic acid. And so this MTHFR, if you have these mutations, you are more prone to holding on to mold, including in heavy metals and other toxins. And so if this reduces your ability to detoxify mold, leading to higher buildup of toxins in the body, you're going to get more expression of mold. And so things like inflammation, oxidative stress, mold-related symptoms like fatigue, brain fog, immune dysfunction, neurological dysregulation, photosensitivity, ringing in the ears, all kinds of stuff can be upregulated in the body because of your genetic proneness to holding on to mold.
And that might explain, what everything you said was a great explanation. Would it help explain when people are like, well, how come I feel the mold more than the other 2 people in my family? Or how come we all have different symptoms from this mold? Even though we're all living under the same roof. And I always remind people too, like, look, my wife and I, we got COVID back in 2020. She lost her sense of taste and smell. I didn't. I had more like fever. I was bedridden for 2 days. She literally never was bedridden, was kind of exercising the entire time. We definitely got the same strain. We're dealing with the same, we're at the same places for sure. But yet we had 2 completely different reactions, right? And so, reminding people that we're all different. As you said, our genes express themselves differently. We have different diets and different chemical imbalances and hormone imbalances, and just everything about us is individual. And
well, just
so,
to further that for you,
that.
sorry, Michael, little delay here. I didn't mean to cut you off, but just to further that, going back to this little boy who had the mold infection. Right? His whole family had mold issues. Dad had asthma and asthma attacks. Mom started getting some eczema and some issues in her scalp with dryness. He got ulcerative colitis, and his 2 sisters were getting cognitive issues, mood swings, and really angry outbursts. So you have 5 people all in the same family expressing mold toxicity differently. 100%. It's just your genetics.
Yeah. No, it's great. It's great to really help, people understand that side of things. I think that's probably where a lot of people get confused. All right, so we covered obviously gut affects human health pretty drastically. Like, not having good gut health is pretty detrimental to our overall health. We talked about how gut dysbiosis and getting out of balance in the gut is one of the key factors that happens, that causes some of these illnesses, especially dealing with mold, right? Mold helping to cause some imbalances as well. We talked about how those imbalances may be different for everybody, right? Some people might have an overgrowth of parasites and overgrowth of Candida as a result, but what we know is that it does help cause some imbalances in the gut, which then branches out into all these other symptoms and health issues from there. We talked about the brain and gut connection and how that there's obviously a connection there through the vagus nerve, and we have all sorts of neurological impacts that can happen with mold exposure, with gut dysbiosis that can happen out of mold exposure, et cetera. What are we missing that we need to cover?
First of all, great memory. That was beautifully said. Second of all, the things we're missing, I mean, that basically covers the gist, but what we really need to get into is what to do about it. Because mold toxicity is a problem. We know it can create a problem. And something I think we do a lot as health experts in the natural holistic field, right? Assuming, again, disease isn't part of your DNA, that something has to be done. We talk a lot about the doom and gloom. Here's the problem. Here's what you need to know. It's going to hurt you. It can kill you. It can create disease. But I think so often we miss, here's the tangible steps on what to do about it, and here's how to go about it. Here's the risk factors. And I think that'd be our next step here for sure.
Good. So I can definitely cover on what to do about it at the house, right? I have tremendous amounts of resources for that. Please go to themichaelrubino.com, go to homecleanse.com, go to changetheairfoundation.org. Get your house, inspected properly, get your house fixed properly, because as Josh already alluded to, you can't really heal when you're stuck inside the problem, right? And so step one, we have to not be stuck inside the problem. I want to give people 3 easy things to do right now for relief, because I know I gave you some websites and places to go check out, but getting information takes time. Getting the right inspector over takes time. All these things take time. Start opening windows and doors, getting fresh air in. Diluting the amount of mold and toxins that you're breathing in is going to provide value. Getting out some microfiber mops and microfiber towels and cleaning your house, removing dust, because all of these particles that we don't want to be breathing in, like mold, like bacteria, like even microplastics, right? All those things settle amongst our dust and enter our body every time we breathe 20,000 times per day. So removing dust is going to be crucial. Get good air purifiers. They don't have to cost a lot of money. My favorite ones are typically always on sale for $150 or less. You don't have to spend an arm and a leg to get good air purifiers. But again, them helping to remove these particles from the air is less entering your body. All those things provide relief. Don't forget to change your HVAC filters, and heck, check the MERV rating on those filters while you're at it, and make sure you've got the best possible MERV rating you can. The higher the number, the smaller the particle can remove. So what I'm really interested in, Josh, and I know so many other people listening too, is how do I help get the gut back in balance? What sort of test do I have to look for? I mean, there are so many different types of tests you can do for the gut these days. Where do you start? And how do you take that information and start to heal that gut?
That's a great question. With all the mold strains, we have to identify, it definitely doesn't hurt to identify what you're working with. We can also go broad. So the first thing we have to do in any situation, before even bothering to identify the strains, even removing them, we have to open drainage pathways. And this is something I think a lot of us sort of forget, especially in the functional medicine world, is we forget to look at drainage. We say, I want to get rid of the problem. Well, you can't evict tenants from the building if the doors are locked. And so to get things out of your body, we have to open up drainage. So drainage, if you think about detoxing as collecting the trash, drainage is bringing it out to the curb. And so if your liver and gallbladder are junked up, which they probably are, especially with a mold infection, if you've got bacterial issues, they're contributing to this toxicity, which means there's more stuff junking up. But drainage is how things sort of move around and exit the body. So think sinuses, skin through sweat glands, looking at liver, lymphatics, bile ducts, bowels, urination. These are the elimination or drainage pathways from the body. Now you go, I pee and poop okay. If you're constipated, that's poor drainage. If you have sinus issues, it's poor drainage. If you have skin issues, psoriasis, eczema, acne, that's poor drainage. It's actually pushing the emergency reliefs and pushing these toxins through the skin to get them out. And this is poor drainage. If you're somebody who has, your stool might be a little on the green side or on the pale side, pale brown or almost clay color, it's either too much or too little bile, which is also a problem. Your bile may not be reabsorbing properly, or it may not be excreting properly. If you have yellowy stools, oily, floaty, greasy stools, it can be a sign there's fat malabsorption issues, or really smelly, rancid stools. It can be a sign of bacteria and overfermentation. If you're gassy, especially those ones that linger in the air, or that you stink up the bathroom, it takes 20 minutes, 30 minutes, or hours to clear, that's bacteria producing excess toxins. We talked about fish poop in the bowl. And so we have to look at, one, what is junked up in the system? All these symptoms can identify poor drainage. So we have to open drainage. Now, everything I'm going to say from here on, Michael, I want to preface, should be done with medical or professional supervision, because we have had people try to demold themselves and put themselves in the hospital. And I want to put a big, bold, underline exclamation mark on this. Do not attempt on your own. It can make you very sick. It can be very, very troublesome, dare I say lethal or fatal in the worst case scenarios. So don't do this without supervision. But to open drainage pathways, there's all kinds of supplements we can take. There's over-the-counter stuff, liver support supplements like NAC, it's N-acetylcysteine, your milk thistles, your TUDCAs, TUDCA is a great one. We've got clients who might be implementing things like coffee enemas, also broad spectrum binders to capture. But once we open up drainage, red light, acupuncture, sweating, exercise, clean, fresh air, supplementation, enema, induction, different things, drainage is opened. So now we're ready to finally remove the problem. But with mold, we have to look at this. This is why it's so individualized. One, you can try to do too much drainage and make yourself extraordinarily ill. Very, very dangerous. So it has to be done under supervision. But number two, we want to open up. We can either begin binding and removing the problem, but think about what binding does. There are certain binders we can utilize. In fact, there's several of them. You have your standard universal binders. So things like bentonite clay, zeolite, charcoal, chlorella, humic and fulvic acid. You have certain ones we'll utilize like glucosamine fiber, even probiotics, right? Certain lactobacillus, or even a common yeast-based probiotic known as Saccharomyces boulardii. These ones can be really beneficial for helping bind onto mold. All kinds of different strains, especially the 36 most common identified by the EPA. So these are great ways to start binding. But if you think about it, these binders kind of work like static cling, where if you were to rub a balloon on the carpet and touch your hair, right, it pulls the static charge. So what some of these binders will do, if you're ingesting them, it goes through and kind of gets into the tissue and pulls these toxins out. Well, it will pull it through many layers of tissue. And certain layers of your tissue will also have different immune responses, or immune systems, we'll say, attached to them. And so as you pull things through, especially in the bowel disease space, Crohn's, colitis, you might do binding, you might see more blood. Not necessarily a bad thing, because it could just be your immune system reacting as it passes through these layers of tissue, but it can also make you very sick and over elicit immune responses. So another thing we have to look at is biofilms. Molds and mycotoxins will contribute to biofilms. If you think of these like a bomb shelter, if you want to drop a bomb on somebody and they're in a bomb shelter, good luck. That's the whole point of the bomb shelter. Biofilms work similarly, where it's sort of this layer and it's protective. So your binders may not get through. Your antifungals, antimicrobials may not get through. So you have to break down biofilms. But in this thick layer of almost like a mucousy-like substance as biofilm, a lot of toxins, mycotoxins and other bacterial toxins, endotoxins we call them, will be sitting inside these biofilms. So if you break them up, guess where they go? Absorb back into the system. So it's this careful regulation between opening drainage, maybe biofilm disruption, maybe binders. It's a huge combination of things that have to be taken into play. And it's very much on the gas, off the gas, on the gas, off the gas, based on your responses, how you're feeling. Any negative symptoms, you pull back right away, flu-like symptoms, sickness, or if you're just getting the flu, don't overwhelm the system, right? So it is a very careful process. I will once again reiterate, do not do this without professional supervision. We've had clients working with us. We've said, hey, take one of these once a day, see how you feel. She jumped up to 2 twice a day right away, was in the hospital in 2 days. So we have to be very, very careful. So always slow, always with supervision.
No, thank you for that disclaimer. It's very important, always getting supervision is really important because, especially with this case, it is a little bit tricky. Not every doctor is aware of what to do and how to do it. And I think, I've seen people get into trouble that way too. Luckily, I've never seen anyone in the hospital, but, it's important to highlight that can happen. Now, we're talking about reactions like a Herx reaction, right?
Yes.
That people might experience with certain products. And this goes back to kind of this medicine being individual type of approach, and everybody is unique. Now, I've heard supplements, binders, for example, that work wonders for some people. That same thing that you hear rave reviews about doesn't work for somebody else and they have a bad reaction. Can you explain a little bit about what Herx reactions are, why they happen, and then what you typically are doing as their medical professional to advise them from that point?
Yeah, absolutely. So if you think of a Herxheimer reaction, it's really just a hypertoxification. So I look at it this way. Your body, it's like a glass of water. As that glass of water starts to fill, you drain it out. That's that drainage we're talking about: skin, sinuses, bowels, etc. It fills up, it drains. Now that it can fill up from stress, from food, from toxicity, bacterial overgrowth, mold infection, whatever it is, the flu, it can fill this cup. If it's not draining out the bottom properly, eventually it's going to overflow. When it overflows, you now have this diagnosable disease condition. The filling is just symptoms piling up: itchy scalp, little bit of bloat, little bit of GI issue, little bit of nausea, irritability, neurological, till the cup gets to the top, it overflows. You go to the doctor finally with blood in your stool or whatever you've got, and they go, yep, here's your diagnosis. The nail is stuck in the foot. Here's some numbing cream and we'll cut it off, right? If they just label this thing. What we want to do instead is see, number one, what caused the cup to fill? Because once it overflows, if you're shaking that cup up, if you're taking binders, you're trying to detox and do drainage, you're shaking that cup, you're going to have spillage. That's your Herxheimer reaction. It's too much for the size of the cup and the amount that it's filled. If your body is too full of toxicity, it doesn't have enough room to shake up and try to get rid of these things, you're going to create this illness. So what we have to do is very slowly and carefully begin maybe vibrating the cup. Try to work on some drainage, get it to empty out the bottom before it overflows. And this is how we sort of do this, and that's sort of what a Herxheimer is. But something we have to look at as well in the repair process. I know we just talked about binding and removing mold and biofilms, but if you think of it, the cup's already overflowed. So we have to know, one, what caused the overflow, what sort of microbe overgrowth, what's contributing to it, etc. Number two, how do we get it to drain? So opening those drainage and detox pathways. But three, what has also gotten wet? So what other residual damage is created? This is part of the microbial overgrowth, that pleomorphing we referenced at the beginning of the episode, that change in bacterial structure where it's tidal waves instead of up and down. Your liver, your gallbladder and bile ducts, your nervous system, the brain, leaks in the lungs. What other systems of your body have now been compromised from these infections and toxicities? And this is really what we have to do about it. But if you move too much too fast, you'll overflow the cup. You'll create a toxic reaction. You create this Herxheimer reaction. Your immune system over-responds. If you actively have an immune reaction, that's anything inflammatory. Asthma might cause an asthma attack. Colitis, it might cause more blood. If you have irritable bowel, it could cause an attack and you might be, either blocked up or having 10, 20 bowel movements a day. If you have the flu, it can overexert those reactions because it will drive your immune system to flooding. And so we really have to be careful about this. And it's a very tailored, catered process, very, very hands-on with micromanagement.
Yep, no, that makes good sense, and why it's really important to, always do this with a doctor so that someone can help guide you when something isn't quite working right or isn't quite having the type of reaction that's expected. It's important to be able to speak up to somebody and say, hey, this is the situation. This is what I'm experiencing. So that's, adjustments can be made appropriately and accordingly. Furthermore, it's important to work with someone that has the background and education that can help you figure out what is the root cause in the first place and what sort of imbalances you do have that need to be corrected. And of course, on top of potentially dealing with mold and everything else that you might be experiencing in your environment. So, Josh has been extremely, extremely helpful. I can't imagine, someone listening to this and not learning a great deal. So I really appreciate you taking the time today to be here. Where can people find you and potentially reach out to you?
Easiest way right now, if you want to make sure you don't lose touch, you can check out the podcast. It's called Reversible. That's Reversible, ABLE, the Ultimate Gut Health Podcast. And so that's a great place to find information about us. We have all kinds of, it's all about the gut. how it reacts to the world, the things that affect it. We did an episode recently with you, Michael, as well on mold and toxicity and how that affects things and what to do about it. We talk about food and anxiety, repairing the gut, how to look at your own stool, your poop, as a crystal ball. Like, what does it tell you about your health? It's all gut stuff related. That's Reverse Able, the Ultimate Gut Health Podcast. And if you're looking for more, we do have a Crohn's Colitis podcast specifically. You can always reach out for help, resources, YouTube, etc. All that can be found on our website. That's gutsolution.ca. That's all singular.ca for Canada, gutsolution.ca.
Josh, thank you so much for all the work that you're doing, helping people heal their guts, especially dealing with mold exposure and how that impacts the human body and the gut and everything else. Really appreciate you, and thank you for being here and helping to educate us.
It's been a pleasure. Thanks so much for having me on, Michael.